He saw the silence. That was Dr. Hargrove's first observation about Elena Martinez on a Tuesday evening in late September when she moved through Mercy General's emergency department like smoke, present but unremarkable, her scrubs navy blue against the white tile, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke at all. Suture kit, Trauma Bay 3, she said to nobody in particular, already restocking the shelf before anyone could ask. 3 words. That was her average per shift. 3 words, a slight nod, eyes fixed on the work in front of her. Dr. Hargrove watched from the nurse's station, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. What he didn't see was the way her hands moved when she sutured lacerations, battlefield precision, sutures placed with the efficiency of someone who'd sewn up worse things than split chins in emergency rooms. 90 seconds from skin prep to final knot. Her needlework was flawless, mathematical, the kind of technique that only came from doing it hundreds of times under conditions where failure meant death. What he didn't see was how she assessed trauma patients with a single sweep of her eyes. A 30-year-old with chest pain, she'd scan him from toes to scalp in 4 seconds and know whether it was cardiac or anxiety before he finished his first sentence. What he didn't see was the way certain veterans on the ward would quiet when she approached, as if they recognized something in her that they couldn't name. What he absolutely did not see was the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket, tucked in her locker behind a spare pair of compression socks. Navy SEAL Team 3, Kandahar deployment, worn edges from dust that clung to everything in that province like a curse. The patch was faded to almost nothing, you had to know where to look to find it, had to unfold it carefully to read the embroidered lettering. Elena kept it there because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away, but couldn't bear to wear it either. It was her relic, her ghost, the proof that she had once been someone else entirely. 2 years ago, Elena Martinez had voluntarily walked away from the Navy after 20 years of active service. 20 years. 3 tours in Kandahar alone. Promotions came easily once you proved you could work under fire, once you'd pulled 16 people from a collapsed building using nothing but your hands and a prayer. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, they'd offered her a desk job, a position training new combat medics at Naval Medical Center San Diego, stability and respect and a pension that would have set her up for life. She'd turned it down. The PTSD from Kandahar had become unbearable by year 19, the nightmares where she was still there, the way her hands shook when she heard loud noises, the fact that she couldn't sit in restaurants anymore because she needed to face the door and count exits. She'd chosen invisibility instead. Chosen Denver, a hospital nobody in the Navy would ever find, a job where she could be nobody, where she could heal in silence, where nobody would ask her name or her story or where she'd gone when she vanished from military service. She'd told no one. Not her commanding officer. Not her parents. Not even her sister Maya, who'd called every week for 6 months asking if Elena was alive, if she'd been hurt, if she was ever coming home. Elena had simply stopped answering the phone and let it become clear that home was somewhere else now. The antiseptic smell of Mercy General's ER was almost comforting, sharp and clean, nothing like the copper and dust smell of field hospitals. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that most people didn't notice but that Elena had learned to tune out, a constant electronic pulse like a heartbeat that never quite matched a real one. It was 1800 hours, she still thought in military time, probably always would, when the automatic doors hissed open and Dr. Hargrove swept through them like he owned the building, which, in a very real sense, he did. His father had been chief of surgery at Mercy General for 18 years. His connections ran through the hospital's board like arterial lines, delivering blood and favor to everyone he considered important. Hargrove himself was 34, board-certified in emergency medicine, and possessed the kind of confidence that came from never once being told no. He wore his white coat like armor, perfectly pressed with creases sharp enough to draw blood. Behind him trailed 3 residents, 2 men and a woman, all wearing the slightly exhausted expression of people who'd been following his lead all day and would probably continue doing so for the next 12 hours. His eyes moved across the nurse's station, cataloging, assessing, before landing on Elena. She was standing 3 feet away, checking blood pressure cuff calibrations on a cart, her movements economical and focused. "Still here, Martinez." His tone carried the lilt of amusement, the particular cadence of someone beginning a performance. Thought you might have quit by now. You know, given the pace. The pressure. The kind of environment that separates the professionals from the, he paused, administrative staff. Elena didn't look up. She continued her work, checking the next cuff, a slight limp barely noticeable as she shifted her weight. The limp came from a shrapnel wound to her left thigh. Kandahar, year 2 of the war, when IEDs were still a novelty and people hadn't learned how to hide them quite as cleverly. She'd walked on it for the rest of her deployment. She'd learned to walk on a lot of things. I'm fine, Dr. Hargrove, she said quietly, her voice level as still water. Cuffs are calibrated. That wasn't the reaction he wanted. You could see it in the way his smile tightened at the edges, the way he glanced at his residents to gauge whether they'd found his comment amusing enough. It hadn't landed the way he'd hoped. A good antagonist always needed an audience, and 3 residents were better than none. He turned slightly, addressing the residents more than Elena, but keeping her in his peripheral vision like prey he hadn't decided whether to strike. You know what I love about nursing, he said, loud enough for the whole station to hear, his white coat moving as he gestured with the casual grace of someone used to being watched. The dedication. The loyalty. But sometimes you get someone who's just, how do I put this, trying to play above their pay grade. Thinking they know more than they do. Thinking one night shift in a combat hospital makes them qualified to. He stopped abruptly, having said something he shouldn't have. Combat hospital. The words hung in the air like a mistake, a small tear in the fabric he was trying to weave. He recovered quickly, moving on, but Elena had heard it. The residents had heard it too, exchanging glances. Did Elena look like she'd served? There was something in the way she moved, something in her hands, but nothing obvious. Nothing written across her forehead. Anyway, Hargrove continued, turning to face the residents fully now, his back to Elena. I'm going to make you all a little wager. I'll give our quiet friend here exactly 1 week. 7 days. By next Tuesday at 1800 hours, she'll have quit. The pace, the hours, the simple fact that she's clearly not cut out for this level of work. Any takers? One of the male residents laughed, a sharp, reflexive sound that seemed to encourage the others. They had probably seen Hargrove do this before, had probably seen other nurses crumble under his particular brand of attention. Elena continued checking the cuff calibrations, her hand steady, her breathing even. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge that she'd heard. She simply finished her current task, marked it as complete in the logbook, and moved to the next station. The thing about having survived Kandahar was that nothing else ever felt quite as dangerous again. Hargrove's words were air. His judgment was weather. The way he was clearly trying to provoke some kind of response, to bully her into proving something, to create drama for his audience, all of it was operating on a frequency she'd learned to tune out years ago when people with actual guns were trying to kill her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Hargrove had noticed something real about her, the combat hospital reference, which meant he was curious now. Curious people asked questions. Questions led to answers. Answers led to recognition. And recognition was the one thing Elena had come to Mercy General specifically to avoid. She finished the calibrations at 1847 hours, exactly as the evening shift was hitting its stride. The ER was beginning to fill, a car accident victim wheeled in by paramedics, an elderly woman complaining of chest pain, a teenage boy with a badly broken arm being escorted by his frantic mother. The chaos was almost welcome. In chaos, people didn't ask questions. In chaos, she could disappear into the work, and Hargrove's words would dissolve into background noise. Her hands moved from patient to patient, starting fours with the kind of precision that came from practice measured in thousands. The needle would go in clean, the line would flush perfectly, and she'd move on to the next crisis. This was where she felt most herself, not as Elena the quiet nurse, but as someone who knew how to function in controlled disasters, how to prioritize, how to keep people alive. But as she passed the nurse's station at 1923 hours, she caught the tail end of a conversation between 2 residents. "Bet's actually happening, I heard. Hargrove's putting money on it." says she'll crack by Thursday. Thursday was 5 days away. Elena had been at Mercy General for exactly 847 days. She had learned to be invisible in that time, to move through the hospital without leaving ripples, to do her job so quietly and so competently that people had learned to simply assume she was adequately trained and leave it at that. In 1 week, if Hargrove had his way, none of that would matter. She reached for her jacket in the locker room, her fingers finding the unit patch sewn inside the lining before she could stop herself. The fabric was worn soft from handling, the stitches coming loose on one corner. She'd been meaning to fix that for months. She let her hand fall away without touching it further. Outside, Denver's September evening was cooling down, the mountains in the distance dark and imposing against a sky that was still holding onto the last light. Elena sat in her car for exactly 4 minutes, not out of distress, but out of a kind of calculation. The statistics on bullying in medical environments were grim. The statistics on what happened to people who pushed back were worse. The statistics on what happened to people who had secrets were worse still. She thought about walking away. She'd done it once before, walked away from a 20-year career, from a pension, from people who depended on her. It was possible to do it. You just made the decision and then you executed it, like any operation. Clean. Fast. No complications. Instead, at 19:34 hours, she started the car and drove back toward Mercy General. Her shift wasn't over until 2200 hours. There were 7 hours left. She had a week, or 5 days if Hargrove was accelerating his timeline, to figure out what to do about the fact that someone was finally starting to see through the quiet and ask questions about who she really was. The cafeteria at Mercy General smelled like industrial bleach and reheated chicken broth, a combination that had stopped bothering Elena weeks ago. She balanced her tray with the precision of someone who'd learned to move through hostile spaces without drawing attention, turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee, the geometry of her lunch perfect and intentional. It was 1,147 hours. Shift change in 13 minutes. She'd made it through 4 hours without speaking to anyone except patients, which meant 4 hours of staying invisible. Dr. Hargrove was waiting by the salad bar. She didn't see him at first, but she felt the shift in air pressure the way a combat veteran feels an IED before it detonates. His presence had a particular density to it, the kind that made rooms smaller. He stood with 4 residents clustered around him like remoras around a shark, their eyes bright with the specific cruelty of people who'd never tasted consequence. His surgical scrubs were pristine. His hair was salted just enough to read as distinguished. He was laughing about something when Elena walked past. That's when his elbow moved. The tray went down like a mortar strike. Her turkey sandwich cartwheeled across the linoleum. The apple rolled in a perfect arc. The coffee, her 3rd cup, the one thing keeping her vertical through the 1,600 hours trauma season, spread across the floor in a dark stain that looked disturbingly like blood. The sound of ceramic breaking against tile echoed across the cafeteria like a gunshot. Everyone stopped eating. Everyone stopped talking. The room held its breath the way a jungle goes silent before something large moves through the underbrush. "Oops," Hargrove said, his voice traveling through the silence with surgical precision. He didn't look at her. He was still facing his residents, still wearing the expression of a man who'd just discovered something mildly amusing. "Better clean that up, sweetheart. It's basically your skill level anyway." The residents laughed. The sound was thin and sharp, like glass breaking in reverse. Elena took one measured breath. She'd taken measured breaths in Kandahar under fire, in operating theaters at 0300 with incoming rounds shaking the tent, in the moment before she decided to walk away from everything and disappear into Denver's anonymity. This breath was no different. Her lungs filled. Her heart rate remained steady. The tremor that tried to move through her hand stayed locked in her chest where no one could see it. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. Just one. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her movements clean and controlled, and when she spoke, her voice was like still water, deep and undisturbed and carrying more weight than its volume suggested. "I've cleaned up worse messes than you'll ever make." Hargrove's expression flickered. Just for a moment, the architecture of his contempt shifted, something solid becoming uncertain. He'd been expecting the trembling. He'd been counting on the breakdown, the moment when Elena would prove she was exactly what he'd announced to the residents, a person too fragile for this work, someone who would crack under the specific pressure of public humiliation. Instead, she'd held. Instead, she'd answered. He turned away without responding, his shoulder catching the edge of a table like a territorial display, and walked back to his cluster of residents. They followed him like he was still magnetic, but the gravity had diminished. Elena could feel it in the way they didn't look at her as they left. She knelt on the linoleum, gathering the broken pieces of her tray. Her hands moved with absolute steadiness, picking up shards of ceramic, wiping coffee from the floor with a paper towel that she pulled from the dispenser with her teeth. A nursing assistant she'd never spoken to appeared with a mop, nodded at her without comment, and began working around her. No one said anything. No one offered to help. That was the architecture of Hargrove's power. He'd made helping her a liability. The thing was, Elena had held worse. She'd held pressure bandages on gunshot wounds while rounds punched through canvas tents. She'd held her composure while telling families their loved ones weren't coming home. She'd held still while watching young men die because there wasn't enough blood in the supply tent, because there weren't enough hands, because the universe had a sense of humor about mercy that bordered on obscene. One tear and a sentence weren't really holding anything. They were just the smallest possible failure to completely shatter, which in this context felt like victory. 3 days passed. Elena worked double shifts. She moved through the ER like a ghost in scrubs, starting fours with her hands moving on muscle memory, reading monitors, documenting observations in a chart hand so precise it looked like typing. She spoke only when necessary. She kept her eyes down. She perfected the art of occupying space without demanding it, existing in the margins of Mercy General's ecosystem like she was renting by the hour. The supply corridor was empty at 1,603 hours on the third day. Elena was restocking the trauma cart, 14-gauge angiocath needles, roll gauze, a fresh box of gloves, when Hargrove came around the corner holding a stack of patient charts like a weapon. He didn't slow down. He didn't say anything. He simply released them, and they scattered across the floor like confetti, paper spiraling in that particular way that loose sheets do when thrown with intention. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Hargrove said, his voice carrying that same surgical precision as the cafeteria. "And next time, try reading them before you embarrass yourself in rounds." He left before Elena was even on her knees. She bent slowly, gathering each page, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Her hand stayed steady. She felt them only once, a single moment where something cold moved through her wrists, and then the discipline clamped down and the trembling stopped. She sorted the charts, checked the order, and rest-tagged them on the desk with perfect precision. As she stood, her hand moved on its own, reaching inside her jacket where the faded unit patch was stitched into the lining. It had been there for 2 years, hidden the way she'd hidden everything else. She didn't take it out. She just touched it through the fabric, let her fingertips find that specific texture, the reminder of who she'd been before she decided invisibility was the only exit strategy that didn't involve a statistic. The thing about living underground was that eventually the pressure from above starts to fracture the foundation. Elena could feel it happening. Hargrove was escalating. The humiliation had passed his lips and he'd seen that it didn't break her, so now he was moving toward something else, something more systematic. This wasn't just cruelty anymore. This was targeting. This was the moment when social attacks began their evolution into something with institutional teeth. She had no way of knowing that her shift would end at 0300 hours with an ambulance bay explosion, with a patient arriving who would change everything, with a moment where her invisible life would collide with a past she'd buried so carefully that she'd almost convinced herself it had belonged to someone else. The ER was running smooth and steady through the midnight hours, the usual trauma rotation, a drunk driver with a fractured radius, an elderly woman with chest pain that would turn out to be anxiety and exhaustion. Elena moved through each case with her practiced efficiency, a piece of the machinery that nobody noticed because it was functioning perfectly. That was the goal. That had always been the goal. At 0300 hours, the ambulance bay doors exploded open like someone had detonated the hinges. Paramedics came through at full sprint, their bodies positioned around a gurney with the practiced urgency of men who'd seen the exact moment where every second became a currency more valuable than blood. GSWs, hypotensive at 80/40, tachycardic 140, GCS dropping fast, the senior medic shouted, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. Incoming trauma, Navy personnel, 3 gunshot wounds, tactical situation, we're not getting the full briefing until he's stable. The trauma bay doors were already open. Elena moved to the station without being asked, her hands beginning their automatic sequence, cutting tools from the sterile tray, for setup with the needle already between her fingers, her body position anticipating where the gurney would stop. She'd done this 12,000 times. Her hands knew the choreography better than her brain did. The patient came through like a storm. Blood soaked through the pressure bandages on his chest, his right shoulder, his abdomen. His tactical gear was already cut away to the waist, exposing the damage, 3 separate impact sites that had the particular signature of small arms fire. His face was pale under the oxygen mask, his pupils reactive but dilated. As they transferred him to the trauma bed, Elena reached for the equipment and her eyes found his face for just long enough to see it clearly. The scar on his left temple was a distinctive crescent shape. Tissue slightly raised from the surrounding skin. The kind of scar you only get when someone stitches it with field equipment while mortars are landing nearby, when someone keeps their hand steady and their focus absolute even though the tent is shaking and the smell of diesel and blood fills every available space. Elena's hands froze for exactly half a heartbeat. Kandahar. The compound wall that had come down in an airstrike. The boy beneath the rubble, maybe 8 years old, his temple torn open and blood running into his eye. She'd pulled him clear with her own hands. She'd cleaned the wound. She'd stitched it with her field surgical kit while rounds punched through canvas above her head and someone screamed for more bandages and the world had narrowed down to the specific calculus of keeping this child alive. That boy had grown up. He'd survived Kandahar. He'd made it to adulthood. He'd taken American citizenship, she could see that in his military documentation now displayed on the trauma board, and he'd joined the teams. He'd become a Navy SEAL. Elena's hands moved automatically, cutting away the rest of his gear, establishing for access with a 18-gauge needle that she inserted with the kind of precision that only came from 2 decades of repetition. The resident beside her called out for Hargrove. The resident was young and frightened and had the expression of someone watching their career flash before their eyes because this patient was crashing and they didn't know how to hold the line. Hargrove arrived in surgical scrubs, moving to the head of the bed with the kind of authority that came from having never truly been challenged. He listened to the patient's chest with his stethoscope, his face going paler as he processed what he was hearing. Muffled heart sounds, he said, his voice carrying the specific tone of a man who'd just realized he was outside his depth. That's cardiac tamponade. We need a cardiothoracic surgeon. Page them immediately. Etta. The resident fumbled for his phone. The monitor above the bed showed the patient's pressure dropping, 75/38 now, the oxygen saturation sliding from 92 toward 85, the heart rate climbing like it was trying to run away from the body it inhabited. He'll be dead in 5 minutes, Elena said quietly. Everyone stopped. Everyone turned to look at her. She'd spoken more words in one sentence than most of them had heard from her in weeks. Her voice was still, like still water, and it carried an absolute certainty that made Hargrove's face go darker. What are you talking about? He demanded, his tone shifting from professional concern toward something with sharper edges. Elena was already moving, already reaching for the pericardiocentesis kit, her muscle memory taking over the way it always did when the mathematics of trauma became simple and brutal and undeniable. The needle slid home with a whisper of resistance. Elena's hands moved on their own, muscle memory overriding the electricity of panic that flooded the trauma bay. 20 years. The scar on the boy's left temple, now a man's temple, had been unmistakable the moment paramedics wheeled him through those doors. 8 years old. Kandahar. Rubble that had been a residential compound 3 minutes before the airstrike. She dug through it with her bare hands, pulling him from the dust, his small body going limp in her arms as she'd run for the forward operating base's aid station with Taliban rounds snapping past her head like angry wasps. Now he was a Navy SEAL with 3 bullet wounds and a blood pressure that had collapsed like a building in slow motion. The pericardial sac was rigid with accumulated blood, cardiac tamponade, the heart being crushed by its own fluid, pressure mounting with every beat until it couldn't beat anymore. The monitor screamed its mechanical panic, 70/30. Then 68. Then 65. The boy's, the man's, oxygen saturation tumbled from 89 to 84 to 76. His pupils dilating. Brain dying. Seconds mattered now. Hargrove stood frozen 3 feet away, his hands hovering uselessly at his sides, his golden boy face draining of color as the clinical mathematics of trauma revealed themselves to be beyond his textbook knowledge. He'd trained for this. He knew the protocol. But knowing and doing were separated by a chasm that many doctors never crossed. Elena had crossed it 1,000 times. He needs pericardiocentesis, Elena said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Now. We don't have time for Hargrove's words tangled in his throat. Then stop talking. She moved to the supply cart, her fingers finding the pericardiocentesis kit with the certainty of someone who'd assembled this exact equipment while lying prone in forward surgical tents under artillery fire. The needle, 18 gauge, long enough to reach the pericardial sac through the xiphoid process, was already prepped. Gloves snapped onto her hands like gunshots in the suffocating silence of the trauma bay. The attending watched her. 2 residents watched her. A respiratory therapist held her breath. Hargrove's hand closed on her shoulder. His grip was strong, his fingers digging into the muscle above her collarbone, his voice dropping to a tone meant to cut through the authority of a command. You step away from that patient right now or I will have security remove you from this hospital. Elena didn't pause. She didn't acknowledge him. She repositioned the SEAL's torso, palpating for the xiphoid process, that small cartilage triangle at the base of the breastbone, and advanced the needle with millimeter precision toward the left shoulder, angling it to thread between the ribs into the pericardial space. Hargrove's grip tightened. She shrugged him off without looking, her attention entirely on the feedback through the needle, the subtle give of tissue yielding to metal, the moment when resistance transformed to emptiness. The syringe filled with dark blood. Rich. Oxygen-starved. Backup blood that the heart couldn't evacuate. 200 cubic centimeters poured into the syringe. The monitor's tone changed. 1 beat. 2 beats. The pitch ascending. Pressure rising, 90/50. Then 100/60. The SEAL's eyes flickered open, consciousness reasserting itself as his brain received adequate perfusion again. His hand twitched. His fingers curled. Elena secured the catheter with the precision of a pilot landing a fighter on a carrier deck, every movement economical, every motion exactly necessary and nothing more. Hargrove had backed away, his face white as a trauma sheet, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. You just ended your career, he whispered. He pulled out his phone before the SEAL's next breath. Before Elena could even step back. Before the attending physician could process what had just happened. Hargrove moved into the corridor, his voice tight with the kind of rage that came from having been rendered irrelevant in front of an audience. Yes, hello, I'm calling about a critical incident at Mercy General. I need to speak to the hospital president. It's an emergency. A pause. Tell him it's Dr. Hargrove from emergency medicine. Tell him one of our nurses just performed an invasive surgical procedure without authorization and with absolutely no qualifications. Yes, I'm serious. She's not even a physician assistant. No, I have no idea where she received this kind of training. Elena stayed with the SEAL, her hands gentle now, checking the catheter placement, confirming the needle position with a second set of eyes, the attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, who was already nodding at her with something that looked like dawning recognition. The other residents exchanged glances. One of them, a third-year named Marcus, had his phone out, which was against protocol, but Elena understood what was happening. Video. Documentation. A record. The SEAL's eyes found hers. He was still sedated from the initial trauma intubation, but consciousness was knocking on the door of his morphine haze, trying to find its way in. His lips moved. Nothing came out except the hiss of the ventilator pushing air into his lungs, the rhythm of mechanical breathing, the sound of a body kept alive by force of will and polymer tubes. "I want this documented," Hargrove's voice carried down the hallway, sharp enough to cut. "I'm calling the State Nursing Board. There are serious questions about this person's qualifications and the source of her medical knowledge. She performed an unauthorized procedure on a federal asset without supervision or consent. No, I'm not exaggerating." Elena heard him call the hospital president's home line. Heard him use phrases like suspicious military knowledge and unauthorized procedures and a potential threat to patient safety. Heard him lay the groundwork for a narrative that would transform her decisive action into a violation. He was skilled at this. That was the terrifying part. He wasn't just lashing out. He was strategizing. He was protecting himself by attacking first, by weaponizing protocol and institutional authority before anyone could ask why he'd frozen. The SEAL's pressure held steady. 102/62. Oxygen saturation climbing, 88, now 91, now 94%. His heart beating with the irregular rhythm of a trauma survivor, not pretty, not textbook, but viable. Alive. Dr. Chen placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. The attending's grip was warm, firm, and utterly different from Hargrove's. "That was remarkable," Chen said quietly. "I've never seen that procedure performed under pressure like that. You saved his life." Elena nodded once, acknowledging the truth of it without dwelling in it. The SEAL's vital signs remained stable. The crisis had passed. What came next was already rolling toward them like storm clouds, inevitable and dark. In the hallway, Hargrove's voice rose higher. "No, I have documentation. I have witnesses. Yes, she's still here. No, I don't recommend interviewing her alone because I have no idea what her background actually is, and given the military bearing and the unauthorized medical knowledge, I have security concerns." The lies were so carefully constructed that they almost resembled truth. They were built from facts. She had performed the procedure, she hadn't had explicit permission, she clearly possessed advanced medical training, and twisted into a shape that made her look dangerous instead of competent. The story he was building would reach the hospital administration within minutes. The State Nursing Board within hours. By the time anyone interviewed Elena directly, the narrative would already be set in concrete. Elena began documenting the procedure in the SEAL's chart, her handwriting precise and clinical, time of procedure, blood volume extracted, catheter placement, vital sign response, post-intervention status. She didn't write her interpretations. Didn't defend her actions. Just the facts. Medical facts. The kind of documentation that either vindicated you or buried you depending on which lawyer was reading it. The SEAL's monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. The heart doing what hearts do when they weren't being strangled by their own blood. The machine worked. The protocol worked. Elena's hands had worked. What happened next would have nothing to do with the patient's recovery and everything to do with institutional power, professional jealousy, and a doctor who'd learned that his authority meant nothing in the presence of genuine competence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent and constant, as Elena finished her documentation and stepped back from the trauma bay to let the night shift nurses take over monitoring. She could hear Hargrove in the administrator's office now, 3 floors up, probably pacing, probably still on his phone, building his case brick by brick. She had maybe 6 hours before security would be escorting her from the hospital. Maybe less. But the SEAL would live. The 8-year-old boy she'd pulled from rubble in Kandahar, who'd grown into a warrior and taken an oath to defend something he hadn't been born into, that boy would live because Elena had remembered how to think like a combat medic instead of like a nurse trying to disappear. That was worth the cost. Probably. For hours after the SEAL stabilization, Elena was transferring him to ICU when the ER doors burst open with the kind of force that made the automatic sensors useless. Someone had kicked them hard. Two men in tactical gear moved through the lobby with operator precision, eyes scanning, hands resting on concealed weapons. Not hospital security. Not police. These were operators, and Elena recognized the signature before her conscious mind caught up, the way they moved like water finding cracks, the controlled breathing, the absolute absence of hesitation. The SEAL was in her bay, recovered enough to be conscious but still vulnerable, when she saw the taller operator's hand tighten on his jacket. "Step away from the patient," the first man ordered, his voice flat as a runway. Elena's body moved on instinct, muscle memory that belonged to a woman no longer supposed to exist. She shoved the SEAL's gurney behind the stainless steel supply cabinet in one fluid motion, positioning herself directly in front of it, arms spread wide. Her voice came out steady, pitched low, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "He's under medical care. You need to leave the premises or I'm calling security." The first man's hand rose. Elena saw the decision in his eyes a half-second before the motion, a choice, calculated and final. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't a negotiation. The first bullet hit her left shoulder, tearing through muscle and bone with the kind of force that spun her sideways. The impact registered as pressure before pain, white noise before agony. She kept her arms up anyway, refusing to fall, refusing to move away from the gurney. The second shot hit her abdomen, and the air left her lungs in a sound she didn't recognize as her own. She bent forward but stayed rooted, feet planted, a human shield made of nothing but decision and stubborn will. The third bullet found her right thigh, and that one brought Elena down, not to her knees but collapsing like a marionette with cut strings, hitting the tile floor in a spreading pool of her own blood. The ER exploded into motion. Hospital security finally arrived, weapons drawn, and the two tactical operators engaged them for exactly 9 seconds before one went down with a security guard's baton in his temple. The other raised his hands, and zip ties went on with the efficiency of people who'd practiced this before. Sirens wailed through the corridors. Code blue announcements echoed. Oxygen hissed through ventilators like mechanical breathing for the whole building. Elena watched it all happen from the floor, her vision starting to pixelate at the edges. Through the narrowing tunnel, she saw Hargrove's office door, locked, sealed shut like a submarine hatch. His face was visible through the reinforced glass, phone pressed to his ear. Not calling 911. Not ordering his staff to help. Calling someone else entirely, his mouth moving in rapid sentences while Elena bled out for floors away from his office, while his patient lay safe because a woman who belonged to him by rank had stood in front of a bullet instead of running from it. They got her to OR fast enough that death was a rumor rather than a certainty. 3 gunshot wounds, 2 requiring surgical intervention, 1 that missed major vessels by 3 millimeters. The surgeon told her later that if the bullet had tracked 2 centimeters to the left, she wouldn't have survived long enough to reach the operating table. The statistics were cruel numbers that added up to survival by mathematics and luck. She woke in recovery 3 days later. Morphine heavy, the world soft-edged and unreliable. A hospital administrator stood by her bed with a clipboard and the expression of someone delivering a sentence, which he was. Ms. Martinez, in light of Dr. Hargrove's detailed report to the State Nursing Board regarding unauthorized surgical procedures, suspicious military knowledge, and given the circumstances surrounding today's incident, which he characterizes as a security breach you may have facilitated, we're terminating your employment effective immediately. Your belongings will be shipped to the address on file. There will be a full investigation into your conduct. Elena stared at the ceiling tiles. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She registered the words the way she registered the beeping monitors, as information, as data, as pain that existed outside of herself. The next weeks were a slow disintegration measured in emptying savings accounts and pain medications that barely touched the agony in her abdomen. She rented a motel room 3 blocks from the VA hospital, the kind of place where the ice machine broke in 1997 and nobody bothered fixing it, where the walls were thin enough to hear other people's desperation bleeding through. She paid cash. She told no one. Her sister in San Antonio called for times. Elena didn't answer. The bullet wounds healed slower than the termination letter, which arrived certified mail and read like a death certificate, Effective immediately, your nursing license is under investigation for scope of practice violations. Hargrove had been thorough. He documented her unauthorized pericardiocentesis 3 times, highlighted the questionable nature of her tactical knowledge, hinted at possible credential fraud. The board's words were surgical, pending investigation. Possible suspension. Material violation of state nursing regulations. 3 weeks after the shooting, Elena sat in the VA hospital waiting room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a sound like dying insects trapped in plastic, and the room smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax and the specific smell of institutional surrender. Veterans filled the plastic chairs, men and women with visible wounds and invisible ones, people carrying the kind of weight that medication doesn't touch. An older Marine with a prosthetic left leg below the knee glanced at her, and Elena saw recognition flicker in his eyes. He'd been in her trauma bay once, 3 years ago, when she was still Senior Chief Martinez and still had a name that meant something in the halls of Mercy General. Then the recognition faded. She was nobody now. A woman in scrubs, but scrubs didn't make you a nurse anymore. Scrubs just made you someone who used to matter. Elena kept her eyes on the floor. The magazines on the table were from 2019. The television in the corner played a cooking show with the volume off, silent images of hands chopping vegetables with surgical precision. Around her, the waiting room hummed with the specific acoustics of collective pain. A woman across from her had her arm in a sling. A man 3 seats down traced the edge of a prosthetic wrist with one finger, over and over, muscle memory with nowhere to go. Elena understood that gesture. She'd been doing it with her own wounds, pressing the edges of the bandage on her shoulder like she could feel the bullet still there, like she could will it back out. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something in her, the part of her that was still trained, still operational, picked up on the 3rd ring. Senior Chief Martinez. A man's voice, clipped, military cadence underneath civilian words. This is Captain James Holloway, Naval Special Warfare Command. I need you to check your email immediately. There's something you need to see. Elena's hand went cold despite the fluorescent heat of the waiting room. I'm not Senior Chief anything anymore. Not yet, the captain said. But you're about to be again. The line went dead. Elena looked at her phone, at the time stamp of the call, 0632 hours exactly, and her hands began to shake. Not from fear. From recognition. From the sound of a door opening that she'd locked behind her 20 months ago, thinking it was sealed shut forever. The waiting room spun slightly, but she closed her eyes and held still, the way she'd held still when the bullets came, the way she'd held still for 20 years. Holding still was what she did best. Holding still while everything changed around her. The heavy beat of rotor blades shook Mercy General's windows at dawn, a percussion that made the fluorescent lights flicker in rhythm. 2 Black Hawks descended toward the parking lot like metal birds of prey, their skids touching asphalt with deliberate precision. The sound was unmistakable, anyone who'd served knew it in their bones. The rotor wash scattered leaves across the ER entrance in concentric circles, and the entire hospital felt the vibration move through its concrete foundation. The doors burst open before the engines fully spooled down. A full SEAL team in dress blues marched through the lobby in formation, their uniforms crisp as fresh folded parachutes, their boots striking tile in perfect synchronization. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound echoed through corridors that had never hosted military protocol. Security moved to intercept them, but the lead officer's stare was enough, a presence that made the air pressure change, and they stepped aside. The SEALs moved like a single organism, disciplined and purposeful, their shoulders back, their eyes forward. One of them carried a sealed manila folder the color of old photographs. They stopped at the main desk. The team leader, a master chief with silver at his temples and decorations that caught the morning light, stepped forward. His voice cut through the hospital noise like a surgical blade through muscle. We're looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. Now. The desk clerk's hands froze on her keyboard. A resident walking past with charts nearly dropped them. 3 nurses turned in unison. The name hung in the air: Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, not Elena the quiet ER nurse, not Elena the outsider, but a rank spoken aloud in a military hospital. The designation changed everything in 3 syllables. Dr. Hargrove stood 15 feet away at the medication station, restocking syringes into the lockbox with mechanical precision. His hand stilled. The color drained from his face as if someone had opened a valve. One of the SEALs, the one with the scar on his left temple, the one Elena had pulled from rubble in Kandahar 20 years ago, the one she'd watched become a warrior instead of a casualty, stepped forward. He was older now, harder, carrying himself with the terrible calm that comes from having already survived the worst. His dress uniform fit like a second skin. When he spoke, his voice was steady as a laser. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. Is that you? Elena emerged from Trauma Bay 3. She'd been checking the equipment, preparing for the day shift, doing what she'd always done, the invisible work. She wore the same scrubs as yesterday, the same faded white coat, the same careful neutrality. Her eyes found his face, and for one moment, the mask flickered. Just a moment. Then it settled back into place. The team leader approached her. Not toward her. Approached like a man approaching a monument. He held the manila folder before him with both hands, the way honor guards held flags. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, he said, and this time it wasn't a question. We need to read your service record aloud. It's protocol. He opened the folder. His eye scanned the first page, and his jaw tightened. Whatever was written there demanded to be spoken. Demanded to be heard. The entire ER had stopped moving. Residents. Nurses. Maintenance staff pushing a floor buffer. Even the heart monitors seemed to pause between beats. The Master Chief began to read. His voice carried the weight of official documentation, the kind of voice that appears in congressional records. 2 Navy crosses for extraordinary heroism under fire. He paused. The room absorbed this. 2 Navy crosses. Not 1. 2. For Bronze Stars with Valor, awarded for meritorious service in direct support of combat operations. Another pause. Hargrove's hands trembled as he set down the syringe box. Purple heart with 3 oak leaf clusters, indicating 3 separate combat-related injuries. The team leader looked up from the folder. Looked directly at Hargrove. 18 years of decorated service as a combat medic and senior enlisted medical officer, culminating in her voluntary retirement from active duty. Voluntary. That word carried its own gravity. She'd chosen to leave. She hadn't been broken. She'd chosen. During her service, the Master Chief continued, reading now to the entire gathered crowd. Senior Chief Martinez provided emergency medical treatment to over 3,200 personnel in direct combat zones. Her actions are credited with preventing 47 combat deaths during Operation Enduring Freedom alone. She walked away from the uniform in 2021 seeking treatment for PTSD sustained during deployment in Kandahar province. He closed the folder. And then we lost her. The Navy couldn't find her. Her family couldn't find her. We couldn't find her. But we never stopped looking. The SEAL with the temple scar stepped forward. I'm the reason she came back. That wound on my temple. I was 8 years old when shrapnel from an RPG took out half my village. Senior Chief pulled me out of the rubble. Treated me under fire. Saved my life. Then she walked away from the Navy for 2 years because the memories got too loud. His voice dropped. But you don't stop being a warrior just because you take off the uniform. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old plaster. His breathing was shallow, almost panicked. A resident next to him took a small step away, as if distance might protect them from what was about to happen. The second agent, the one from the FBI who'd been investigating the hospital breach for 3 weeks, stepped forward with another agent flanking him. The one carrying a folder of documents that weren't service records. These were internal. Forged. Wrong. The agent's badge caught the light as he clipped it to his belt. Dr. Richard Hargrove, we've been investigating the breach that occurred in this facility on the night of October 14th. During our inquiry, we discovered that you attempted to forge Elena Martinez's nursing personnel records and falsify state nursing board complaints to cover your own gross negligence during that incident. That's absurd. Hargrove's voice cracked like thin ice. This is a misunderstanding. I was simply following protocol. You called the state board at 0430 hours, the agent continued, his voice dispassionate as a metronome. For hours after Nurse Martinez saved a patient's life using a pericardiocentesis procedure that you refused to perform. You fabricated concerns about unauthorized procedures and claimed she had suspicious military knowledge that posed a security risk. The agent consulted the documentation. You then contacted your father, who sits on this hospital's board of directors, and leveraged his connections to force her termination while she was still recovering from 3 gunshot wounds sustained protecting a patient. The resident stared. 3 gunshot wounds. They'd known Elena was injured. They hadn't known how. Hadn't asked. The quiet one didn't merit questions. You also altered her incident report, the second agent said, stepping closer, to minimize your failure to act during the shooting. You claimed you were calling security when hospital surveillance footage shows you locked yourself in your office for 47 minutes while Nurse Martinez bled on the ER floor. Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. His hands moved as if searching for purchase, for something to hold, for any handrail in the darkness that was opening beneath him. My father will, the board will, I have connections that. The first agent produced handcuffs. They hung from his hand like a judge's gavel. Dr. Richard Hargrove, you're under arrest for falsification of federal medical records, obstruction of a federal investigation, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the state nursing board. The handcuffs moved with terrible inevitability. They clicked open like a promise. When they closed around Hargrove's wrists, the sound echoed through the ER, a definitive, audible end to something. The 2 agents flanked him, one on each side, moving him toward the lobby entrance. The seals parted like a corridor of judgment, their dress uniforms creating a gauntlet of witness. Hargrove moved between them, his face the color of old bone, his voice repeating denials that no one heard anymore. The lobby doors opened. Camera flashes erupted from the parking lot, news crews that had been waiting, somehow knowing that this moment mattered. The perp walk was captured in perfect light, Dr. Richard Hargrove being led into federal custody while the Black Hawk sat idle in the parking lot, their rotors still, their promise complete. The hospital president arrived moments later, breathless, already calculating damage control, already reaching for his phone. The team leader stepped toward him before he could dial. His voice was quiet. Quiet voices are the most dangerous. Where is Senior Chief Martinez? And why is she not already being reinstated to active status? The president went pale. We'll reinstate her immediately. Full back pay. Any legal fees. Whatever she. You protected the man who tried to destroy her, the Master Chief said. His eyes were the color of Pacific water at depth. You terminated a decorated combat veteran while she was recovering from injuries sustained protecting a patient in your facility. That's not medical administration. That's conspiracy. The president had no response. There was no response adequate to the weight of what had happened. The entire structure of authority that had held Hargrove aloft, the board connections, the institutional power, the leverage that came from knowing important people, had evaporated in the time it takes a pair of handcuffs to close. Elena stood where she'd been when they arrived, just inside the entrance to Trauma Bay 3. Her hands hung at her sides. Her face was still. The faded unit patch that had lived hidden inside her jacket lining for 2 years, sewn into the lining like a secret, like a prayer, like a refusal to fully disappear, existed now only in memory. But something else had taken its place. Something that no one could hide again. The SEAL with the temple scar approached her. "Senior Chief," he said, and the words were a salute. "Welcome home." Elena's jaw tightened. Just barely. The only visible crack in the composure that had carried her through 2 years of invisibility. I'm going to need a strong cup of coffee, she said. And maybe some jello. The SEAL smiled. It was the smile of someone who understood that humor after trauma is not weakness, it's proof that something human survived intact. 6 months later, Elena stood on the deck of USNS Mercy, the Navy hospital ship cutting through Pacific waters that gleamed like polished steel. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood orange. The faded unit patch wasn't hidden anymore. It was sewn openly onto her dress uniform, a Navy corpsman's insignia above it, the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer on her sleeve where it belonged. 20 young combat medics stood before her on the deck, 18 men and 2 women, all of them with that particular quality of alertness that comes from knowing they'll carry lives in their hands. When you're under fire, Elena said, her voice steady as a surgical laser, you don't have time to doubt. You trust your training. You trust your hands. You remember why you're there. The 8-year-old child caught in rubble. The operator bleeding out. The grandmother trying to reach safety. They all matter. They're all worth every skill you have, every protocol you know, every moment of training that brought you to that second. One of the younger medics raised her hand. Senior Chief, is it true you walked away for 2 years? How did you come back? Elena's hand found the unit patch. The fabric was worn smooth by time and salt air. I needed to heal, she said. And I learned something important. You don't stop being a warrior just because you take off the uniform. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You need hands that remember. You need a heart that won't quit. And you need to know that the person standing next to you, whether they're in camouflage or scrubs, might have survived something that would have broken someone else. Respect that. See that. Behind her, the SEAL she'd saved, the boy from Kandahar who'd become a man who understood sacrifice, approached with her new commanding officer. Senior Chief, we have incoming wounded from a training exercise inbound on transport helicopter. Your skills are requested in surgery. Elena nodded. Turned to her students one last time. This is the moment. This is always the moment. Go. She descended to the surgical bay, her limp barely noticeable now, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 previous hours. Through the porthole, the Pacific spread out like a promise, endless, deep, forgiving. In Denver, in a community college classroom somewhere on the north side, Dr. Richard Hargrove stood before CPR dummies and taught compression techniques for a salary that didn't cover his apartment rent. His medical license was revoked. His father had resigned from the board in disgrace. His name had become a footnote in a story about what happens when institutional power collides with actual honor. But Elena didn't think about Denver anymore. The sky above the ship was endless and clear, and the salt air tasted like second chances. For the first time in years, she was exactly where she belonged. In the surgical bay, beneath her hands, a young sailor's heart began to beat stronger. Another life carried forward. Another impossible outcome made possible. Forgiveness tasted like purpose. And it was sweet. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.